I have to admit, when I first saw Crow Country popping up in my feed with lots of people giving it high praise as being a true return to survival horror, I kinda just expected a basic Silent Hill or Resident Evil clone. But honestly, I couldn't be happier to be wrong. Crow Country was released by SFB Games on May 9th, 2024. It's an indie survival horror game that does mimic a lot of the charm of classic titles like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but it's also much more than that. It's a pretty common trend these days for a lot of indie developers who grew up playing classic games on the original PlayStation to try and emulate that nostalgic feeling they had from the 90s. And while I share in some of that nostalgic interest, there are times where I feel like the PS1 style gameplay and graphics are more of a gimmick than actually conducive to making a good game. And that's where Crow Country stands leagues above the rest. It is, without a doubt, the most nostalgic game I have ever played, and I really do not say that lightly. But nostalgia doesn't make a game good or bad. Nostalgia is a feeling, and if you purely want a nostalgic experience, then just go play games from your childhood. But if you want something new and fresh, and just damn fun along with the comforting feeling of nostalgia encapsulating the entire experience, then Crow Country is the game to try. But don't just take my word for it, let's talk about why. Starting with the game's art direction, if you spend even 30 minutes with this game, you'll immediately understand why this is a major point of praise during reviews. When I first started looking into the game, I heard a lot of people say it has a Final Fantasy VII style aesthetic, especially in regards to character models. And after experiencing it myself firsthand, I definitely have to agree. All the characters of Crow Country have a very simplistic design style that almost mimics toys or action figures that is very similar to the Final Fantasy VII character models. For example, our main character Mara seems to be made up of individual and simplistic pieces that connect together in a way that directly reflects the animation skeleton beneath her outer shell. This type of design is pretty reminiscent of early 3D game models, where it was more important to keep models simple so they were easier to animate and less resource intensive for the early technology. But I don't think this has a purely artistic benefit. Having a character model that directly reflects their underlying animation rig means that the developers are able to add in these very charming animations without worrying too much about their character models behaving erratically. What this means in practice is you get animations like this, where Mara feels integrated into the world and seems to interact with it directly, rather than doing some generic pickup animation and then the item suddenly appears in their hands. This feeds a lot into the characterization and personality of Mara, which is another great point for this game that I'll go into more later. This might seem like a minor point, but Crow Country is filled with this kind of polish that has a significant impact on the entire package that makes the game really stand out. Another example is the way items blend into the environments. Throughout the game, you'll find items hidden around the environment such as ammo, med packs, antidotes, and so on. The items and environments all fit into that pre-rendered background aesthetic of early 3D games. But with Crow Country, all the backgrounds and environment are all real active models that just mimic that classic style. The effect of that is an extremely satisfying experience that I think anyone who's played a game with pre-rendered backgrounds can understand. Instead of just having a background that looks magnificent and intricately designed that you just sort of walk around in front of, Crow Country gives that same intricate detail, but with the satisfaction of being able to actually directly interact with what we can see. So it's a great feeling when you see items lying around the room that just seem to be a normal part of the clutter of the environment, and you go to interact with them to realize they're much more than that. The objects and content of the world around you suddenly become important and feel immersive and real to your experience. It's similar to the reason why immersive sims and games like Skyrim end up making you feel really integrated in the game. And it's not just the items you can pick up, like antidotes or key items. You get the same feeling from the puzzles and even the notes you interact with. Puzzles are made up of pieces of the environment, but also have their own animations and interactions that feel integrated into the room, rather than a disembodied object on top of a static background. Suddenly, the entire room comes to life and goes from feeling like a static room that you just look at to a dynamic, workable playground of experimentation and discovery. And even the notes you find around the map add to the immersion of the game. When Mara interacts with pictures or binders, she'll actually move them around directly in her environment before you read the details within. This bit of polish adds so much by never pulling you out of the experience with too much of a stale, video gamey interaction. This remains pretty consistent for Crow Country, and even though you can't interact with everything, so many of the objects in rooms are relevant that it makes a big difference. What all this means is, when you enter a room, in a lot of games you first take in all the visual information and try to assess what you're seeing. You look around and take in the surroundings, then bit by bit you try to figure out the rules of the room, of what is and isn't interactable, and what effect different objects in the room have. For classic PS1 games, especially games with pre-rendered backgrounds, the backgrounds and interactable game space never quite felt connected. Even as a child, I remember getting the feeling of, oh, well there's this thing right here, but why can't I interact with it? Crow Country removes that barrier for you. Whenever you enter a new room, you first take in all the visual information, but then go to interact with things and realize, oh, there's actually so much going on here that I didn't even realize at first glance. This isn't just a room filled with pretty stuff to look at, all those parts of the environment actually have a purpose that I should care about. And as you continue through the game and get used to that experience, each new room you encounter gives you a feeling of curiosity and excitement to see what's hidden beneath the surface. I think this effect is one of the things that moves this game from feeling like just another game in the recycled survival horror formula to being something that truly stands out on its own. Now, let's talk more about the game's setting and art style directly. Crow Country is set in an abandoned amusement park, so your entire time playing through the game will be spent exploring through its various themed sub-locations with their own unique designs. Besides that, there are plenty of staff-only areas that feature more industrious layouts, as well as some totally unexpected and standout locations that don't seem to make any sense in the context of an amusement park. The juxtaposition between these locations immediately throws the game into a sense of mystery beyond the simple questions of, why is it abandoned, and what's up with the monsters here? I think the game also benefits from the variety of locations by each place never feeling confusing, and every time you unlock the ability to travel to a new section of the park, you're always given a sense of excitement to explore the new environment you're in. Abandoned locations are always great settings for horror because they always leave behind the traces of what usually would be ordinary, but steeps you in an uncanny feeling that something is just not quite right. It adds an overall tension to things that makes you question everything and whether you're actually safe in this place. And as you find out pretty quickly, yeah, you're not. Going back to overall aesthetics though, the game has a pre-rendered background style that I mentioned before, but it also has this weird pixelated filter over top of it to sort of simulate the pixel-like graphics of the era. This clearly gives the game a distinct style that immediately catches your attention the first time you see it, and also obviously fits that trendy PS1 aesthetic gimmick. But I honestly have some mixed feelings about its use in Crow Country. There are times when I find myself unsure what the hell I'm looking at because of the pixelated filter distorting what I'm seeing. In some ways, this creates an interesting experience akin to the idea of seeing a figure in the dark and needing to squint to make out what it looks like, and that can have a good horror effect. But I think in practice, most of the time it just obscures in a way that's frustrating and requires me moving the camera back and forth to try and parse whatever I'm seeing. I'd be really interested to see the developers add an option to manipulate that filter to the player's preference. I think it'd be really cool and interesting to see the original model's look without a filter on. At the very least, I'd like the option to turn the effect down a bit so I can take in more of the details of things without struggling to see. I think this would be a good compromise between people who love the filter's pixelated aesthetic and those who don't, or for people who just find it slightly too intrusive like myself. But on to what is a major success of Crow Country, its sound design, and it is fantastic. The music is absolutely top-notch and ties together the entire aesthetic of the game into a nostalgic gut punch that you just can't ignore. It reminds me so much of the dreamlike atmosphere produced by the sounds of Nobuo Uematsu across the various Final Fantasy games of the PS1 era. Different rooms and areas throughout Crow Country have their own music that plays whenever you enter that adds so much personality to each location. From the spooky and bright sounds of Fairy Tale Town, to the gothic classic horror sounds of the Haunted Hilltop, to the dreamlike atmosphere of the Ocean Kingdom. And to the comforting sounds of refuge in various locations throughout the park. All of the music just adds so much to the game, and what we've heard is only a small fraction of the wonderful music throughout. As a matter of fact, people love the music so much, the composer Akeroyd released an entire soundtrack on Bandcamp for everyone to purchase and enjoy, after many, many requests, as their update says. But not every room has music. Some rely more on atmospheric, droning horror tones and sounds that give proper weight to these locations. Here's just a few examples. These tracks help keep the atmosphere and feel of the game focused on horror rather than a fantasy-like RPG theme. And as far as sound effects go, the game also does a really good job. Along with the atmospheric music of certain environments, we also get the background sounds of flickering lights, strange liquid dripping from old pipes, and the intense whipping of wind, just to name a few. Some of my personal favorites are the saws underground, and the sounds of dialogue between the characters that mimic that classic RPG sound when characters aren't voice acted. The enemies also exhibit a variety of disturbing and creepy sounds. Overall, the sound design of Crow Country is rock solid, and an absolutely crucial part of the game's identity that just wouldn't be the same without it. So, with art direction covered, let's talk about character design. All the characters in Crow Country have so much personality and charm to them. From the naive and stubborn Detective Harrison James, to the headstrong and confident lawsuit attorney Julie Barron, all of the game's characters stand out and bring a lot to the game's story. And Mara's interactions with them are always filled with so much charm that you can't help but enjoy every time you get the chance to talk to one of these NPCs. It does really well to break some of the repetition of solving puzzles and fighting off enemies. Each character has their own place within the story with their own unique perspectives and motives, but most sharing the same goal of trying to find the park's owner, Edward Crow. And despite the character's low-poly classic style, each is visually distinct and distinguishable, with their own character traits played off in their visual design. As for Mara herself, she's just an absolute joy to play with, and has a cheeky charm that is just so fun to have for our main character. She reminds me a lot of Leon in Resident Evil 4, who makes a lot of humorous comments as you examine different parts of the environment. Here are just a few examples from Crow Country so you can see what I mean. These little interactions add a ton of character to Mara and keep her from feeling like a lifeless avatar. Speaking of, Mara as a character is a bit shrouded in mystery. When I first started playing, I just accepted there wasn't much about Mara that I knew, and that it would be slowly revealed to me over time. But as I'll cover more in the story section later, the more Mara you get, the more you realize how much there is hidden beneath her carefree surface. For now though, let's talk about the gameplay. First, I want to preface that everything I discuss about the gameplay is based around the survival horror difficulty, which is the default normal difficulty game mode. And later, I'll discuss the Murder of Crow's hard mode difficulty, as it fixes a lot of issues that I'm going to be pointing out. So, Crow Country is a survival horror game where you have to run through an abandoned amusement park while avoiding deadly monsters to solve puzzles, all with the goal of finding the park's owner, Edward Crow. You run around the game world equipped with a starting pistol, and you steadily fight off enemies as you move from place to place. Being a survival horror game that takes after classics like Resident Evil, the game has an item economy that you have to manage to keep yourself alive. Making sure you have enough bullets, med packs, and antidotes is a matter of life or death. However, this is one of the weaker points of Crow Country I want to point out. There is a unique and interesting economy of ammo, where certain puzzles require you to expend ammo to complete them, or you need to shoot boxes or glass bottles to obtain other items you may need such as medpacks or antidotes. And this would be a great system, but honestly, there are so many ways to acquire ammo that you very rarely have to worry about running out. You can search trash cans, break boxes, and kick vending machines to get free items. And there seems to be no limit to how many of these items respawn. This really trivializes the survival horror aspect of the game and detracts from the tension that a comparable game like Resident Evil excels at. Now, let's talk about the controls, because this game has a unique layout that takes some getting used to. Replicating a similar movement scheme to the original Resident Evil games, Crow Country uses a tank control scheme for D-pad and a more modern movement scheme for analog. I personally recommend playing this game with a controller using the analog sticks, unless you want tank controls for a more classic feel. This game has an isometric-like camera position, but the camera can be freely moved around with the analog stick, so you can take a look around all you like. This actually has a really nice effect in some instances where there's things just out of sight and you're able to pan the camera around to get a little more detail. This gives me the impression that the developers planned their levels very carefully and kept these kind of considerations in mind, which is great. Part of getting used to the control scheme is in how Mara aims her gun. When you aim, you stay stationary and have to move your gun around to hit your target. This is actually more difficult than it looks, especially as she tends to sway a bit on her own. This can be a little frustrating at times, but I think it's ultimately a good thing as it really adds tension to the moments where you have to stop and fight off enemies as they're running towards you. Not only that, but you also have to actively keep reloading when you run out of ammo, which can really create some dramatic moments. There are 4 guns in the game total, by the way, and they're pretty standard as far as survival horror games go. There's a pistol, shotgun, flamethrower, and magnum. Each gun has a laser sight hidden somewhere around the map that helps you aim, and the guns can be upgraded once by completing certain puzzles that reveal these hidden mushroom boys, who I just love, by the way. I mean, just look at the little guy. Anyway, the handgun can get an upgrade in power, the shotgun gets a capacity upgrade to hold 4 instead of 2 shots, the flamethrower gets a range upgrade, and the magnum gets a power upgrade, as well as multiple hidden ammo packs, since they're not normally obtainable like the other ammo types. On the subject of upgrades, you can also get a med pack upgrade that makes you heal more, and running boots that make you run a lot faster. Another thing to note that I still don't think I got used to even after beating the game was how the camera snaps to your aim. So like in Resident Evil, you can do a 180 to turn and face the enemies behind you, which is great. But the reason this works is because in Crow Country, your camera automatically points to wherever your gun is aimed. And that seems like it'd be a good thing, because you want to see wherever you're pointing your gun, but more often than not, it just causes issues. When you tend to aim, which suddenly snaps the camera into position, it often takes a second or two to calibrate yourself to where you're pointing, and you end up aiming all over the damn place. This is an issue I've seen with many people I've watched play the game, so it's not just a me problem either. All that said, the only other controls are interacting with objects, running, and opening your menu and map. The menu shows your health state, equipped weapon, and items in your inventory, like any standard horror game. You can open your map from this menu where you can see the different sections of Crow Country as you discover their respective maps. There's also a secret item map that marks which rooms still have unsolved secrets in them, which I really appreciate a lot in games like this. Overall, the map is really useful and things are clearly marked, so I never found myself getting lost and frustrated, like I've talked about in previous videos. As for save stations, they're spread out across the map and always take on some form of fire. You can tell you're in a safe room by the music when you approach and the sparkling effects around the fire. You can also find collections of all the game hints and puzzle notes you found throughout the game in these safe rooms to reference back to later. This is great when you don't want to go all the way across the map to a specific room to reread a note, but it's also a compromise to make you run back to a safe room rather than keeping all your notes easily accessible in your inventory, which I think is a pretty good compromise. Speaking of notes and puzzles, like I mentioned before, there are various objects throughout the environment that Mara needs to interact with that are typically a part of some puzzle to be solved. Crow Country has a lot of finding items and backtracking to previous rooms to finish puzzles, like most games of this type. There are only a certain number of key items, and the puzzles themselves are pretty straightforward. But to be honest, I think this is another area where the game could use some work. Some puzzles I found to be confusing and really required me to think of my own, and had a good, satisfying impact when I solved them. Whereas for others, the developers just hold your hand and walk you through the entire thing. Throughout the map, there are notes and journals scattered around that give you lore information or hints as to where to go or what you may need to find. And then sometimes they just outright tell you exactly how to solve a puzzle. Like, what the hell is this? Why do I need a note that tells me the exact combination for this puzzle when all the details I need to complete the puzzle are perfectly available for me to figure out on my own? But it gets even worse with the fact that there's a free hint system that gives you up to 10 hints if you get stuck on any of the puzzles. So not only do you get explicit answers from notes, you can just skip that process entirely by using the hint system as well. I definitely don't recommend touching this if you want any challenge at all. However, there are actually some great puzzles that took me a bit to solve, such as the Ophelia Tomb secret, which requires you to utilize some functionality in an entirely separate, unrelated room. And then there's just basic math. For the most part, I don't think the puzzles are bad, and I did have a lot of fun getting new items and backtracking to complete those puzzles I had to leave behind before, which I can't say about most games of this type. For most other games, it's usually a hassle and stressful, but with Crow Country, it's surprisingly just fun. But I can't deny the game would benefit so much more with more complex or interesting puzzles than some of the ones we get. Now, let's talk about enemies and traps that you'll encounter throughout the game. There's a variety of different bizarre amorphous creatures that spawn around the map randomly that'll try to kill you. These enemies have a good variation of designs from each other with their own specific behaviors and creep factor. For example, this guy creeped me the fuck out when I first came across him. Ugh, just the way he shakes and wanders around making that horrible sound made me physically cringe the first time I saw him. And I honestly love it. It's kind of rare for me to get honest, creeped out emotion from games, so I can appreciate it, although it made my skin crawl. Anyway, when you first start the game, you encounter a few enemies here and there, mostly these zombie-like humanoid flesh monsters wandering around. But as you go further and further into the game, you begin encountering a wider variety of monsters to deal with as time goes on. But that's not all. You also start to encounter different kinds of traps popping up here and there that you have to avoid, and the further you get, the more variety of these you see. These vary from bear traps, glass gas traps, falling chandeliers, and these gas-spraying crow heads. If you get hit by these gas traps, as well as if you get hit by enemies sometimes, you become poisoned and need to heal yourself with an antidote or large med pack. Now, generally speaking, the monsters in Crow Country really aren't that much of a threat. Most of the time, these enemies just slowly wander around and are often easy to run past. The only real challenge is when there's no clear path because too many of the enemies or traps are in the way. But that only happens every now and then, and when it does, you just burn through your ammo and get it all replaced in no time anyways. One thing I will say that I liked about Crow Country is the random variation and increased frequency of enemies and traps that you come across while backtracking. As you progress through the game and story, if you avoid taking out enemies and traps and just run past them, later on they just build up more and more, and it becomes trickier to run through some areas. So while you don't necessarily have to fight almost any normal enemies through your playthrough, it may be better just to take them out if you don't need ammo at the moment. I think this is a great design choice, and is one of the few redeeming factors for making the normal difficulty have some amount of challenge. So ultimately, the only real challenges this game can throw at you are low resource constraints, difficult puzzles, and tough enemies that you have to consciously decide whether it's worth dealing with or not. These are all the basic fundamentals of a survival horror game. And on normal difficulty, Crow Country fails in all three areas. But big credit to SFB Games for listening to their fans, because they've blessed us with the Murder of Crows difficulty. This new difficulty takes the game from feeling like a horror-themed adventure with puzzles into the true realm of survival horror where it's meant to be. First off, enemies are a lot more aggressive. They move a lot faster, chase you for longer, as well as lunge towards you if you try to run past them. And with that, a new spike strip trap has been added as well, which takes up a ton of space and requires you to seriously consider your next moves carefully. So now, you can't just casually run through areas and ignore all the enemies as inconsequential, which means you're going to be doing a lot more fighting. And with that, vending machines, trash cans, and the free ammo you keep in the trunk of your car at the beginning of the game all no longer give you items anymore. The only exception to this is if you're out of ammo and can't complete a puzzle that requires you to shoot something. Before, the game would give you a package of 8 ammo, but now, you just get a single bullet to help you. But wait, there's more. Health packs heal less now, and when Mara reaches an injured health state, she can't run anymore, which creates some seriously intense situations if you're out of healing items. And finally, all of the blatant answers to puzzles you get from notes, as well as the hint machines in each of the main areas, are now all gone, meaning you have to actually solve the puzzles on your own. So that's a ton of changes to the game, and I'm happy with every single one of them. Each enemy encounter is a constant internal dialogue of, is it worth using the limited ammo I have remaining to take out this enemy, or would I be wasting it? Is this area important enough that I have to keep coming back and risk taking damage every time I pass through if I don't kill this enemy now? Tension with decisions like this are what makes the survival horror genre what it is. I know I've been criticizing the game a lot about the difficulty of the normal mode, but I think all these hard mode changes really take the game to the level it needs to be to fix all the major issues I had with the game. The only change I think the devs should consider is making the hard mode the default difficulty. Or even remove the exploration mode entirely, because honestly, the default setting is so easy I don't even see the point of an exploration mode anyway. I really wish I had played through the game on hard mode for my first experience, and I really think I lost out on so much this game had to offer. New players such as myself aren't going to know the default difficulty is too easy and that hard mode is the true way to play. And I think setting hard mode as the default will give players the proper survival horror experience that I think most people really wanted from this game. Now, let's dive into the story of Crow Country. Except, I can't remember the name of the main character, so you know what, let's just watch the intro cutscene. Oh shit, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Anyways, yes, you are Mara Forrest, a young woman who has arrived at the abandoned Crow Country amusement park. When you first arrive, you have a police file laid out on your car showing that the landowner, Edward Crow, is reported missing by his daughter, Natalie Crow. Also mentioned is Detective Harrison James is assigned to investigate, and the last person to see Edward Crow is someone named Mr. Tolman. We'll learn more about these individuals later. So we head into the park and begin poking around, doing whatever we can to find Edward Crow. In the first little plaza area, we come across a magazine article in one of the bathrooms about supposedly fake photographs of a strange creature within the Crow Country Park, taken by someone named Arthur Mole. As we continue wandering around, we eventually make our way into the first area, Fairy Tale Town, where we find an injured Arthur Mole himself laying against a barrel in the middle of the path. We ask him what's going on, and he explains he's here to try and get a better photo of the strange creatures here after being accused by the magazine, but ended up getting injured by one of them. Just as a note, if an NPC has an ellipses icon above their head, there's still more dialogue you can have with them, so make sure to keep talking to them. We can use one of our medkits to wrap up his leg and carry him back to our car at the beginning where he'll stay for the rest of the game, but you can return back to talk to him as things change. Continuing onward, we eventually find a big wooden crate containing a bunch of gold ore all the way from Brazil? Now what in the hell is gold ore from Brazil doing in an amusement park? Well, as it turns out, Edward Crow and his excavator Tolman have been digging up gold on Crow Country's land, which explains where Crow's mysterious wealth comes from. We find an excavation site with some odd machinery around. There's a crane with an attached chain leading down to a hole deep below with strange sounds coming from beneath. Also leading down into that same hole is a pipe running from a machine containing some kind of liquid that we're unsure about. But perhaps the most bizarre machinery around is a standing flamethrower pointing at the chain. Now what does any of this have to do with excavation? Well, nothing, as we'll realize later. Throughout the game, we find multiple records from Tolman documenting the strange circumstances behind the weird creatures and mystery behind the park and excavations. One record in the dig site tells us that they originally hired an external company to do the excavations, but they took too long and started forming a paper trail. Then they began to ask details about the roots being excavated, which he had to immediately shut down. Now, I don't know why they're digging up roots. I don't see any roots around here. I sure don't see no trees, but we'll just leave it for now. Anyway, the rest of Tolman's records tell us some interesting information about some break-ins taking place down by something called the Pool. He notes that there's no evidence of an actual break-in, and when he tries to communicate with the person down there over the intercom, he gets no response, but notes that something feels off. The person's clothes don't fit him, and he keeps making strange sounds. This person is named the Guest by Edward Crow, who locks him away in a cell built up in a storage room in the staff section of the park. Tolman notes that Edward tries to communicate with him and plans to run some tests and monitor him. Later, Tolman's records note that 2 more guests appeared in the pool room, but describes them as being even more deformed than the first. He describes them as broken, wrong shape, falling apart. Tolman notes that after 23 minutes of trying to talk with them, Crow shoots them both. So far what we know is that Edward Crow is running some kind of excavation of some kind of roots or gold. It's not entirely clear at this point. We also know that these strange creatures seem to be coming out of something called the Pool, and Crow brought them up from the underground to the cell they built out of the older storeroom. As we come to find out from a few different sources, apparently Crow Country was shut down a few weeks after a 15-year-old girl named Elaine Marshall was injured at the park. As we learn later, Elaine Marshall apparently wandered near the cell where the guest was kept and was attacked, causing her to be taken to the hospital where she was treated for cuts on her stomach and chest. One of the main sources of this information is Julie Barron, who we encounter trying to enter the area near Edward Crow's office. When we let her in, she lays out some pieces of information for us for the attention of Edward Crow. As it turns out, she's the hired lawsuit attorney for the Marshall family here to find Edward Crow. We also find a few legal summons demanding Crow to come to court regarding the lawsuit, including one stating he hasn't responded in 14 days. So he clearly never shows up, hence why Julie is here. One of the things Julie sets up on the table is a picture of Elaine Marshall, as seen here. And another is Elaine's medical records from the hospital, which denotes the injuries I mentioned before, but also that her wounds are not healing due to some form of bacterial infection the doctors have no idea how to treat. At another point, we encounter Natalie Crow, the daughter of Edward Crow who filed the original police report Mara had at the beginning of the game. We find her standing in the corner of the room outside his office vomiting. She mentions she feels sick and has a bad headache and dizziness. We offer to treat her with an antidote, which helps make her feel better. Apparently, when the guests wandering around the park attack you, they infect you with a strange bacterial infection that makes their victims very sick. This explains Elaine's condition in the hospital, Natalie's sickness, and why some of the guests' attacks poison us and require us to use an antidote to heal it. But this isn't the only information we get from Natalie Crow. When she asks who we are, we mention we're Agent Mara Forrest, sent here to respond to the police report she filed. Natalie, feeling a bit shocked, asks about Detective Harrison, who she spoke to on the phone before, and Mara just makes up a half-cocked excuse for his absence. Speaking of Detective Harrison, later on we find our way back to the plaza towards the entrance of the park, where we find him standing there next to a bike. Talking to him, he tells us we should probably leave and offers to escort us out. Mara changes the subject, and Detective Harrison explains he's a police officer who was supposed to be here hours ago, but apparently some kid broke into his car and slashed his tires this morning. I wonder who could have done that. Well, anyway, then we get some cute dialogue between Mara and Harrison. I just love the interactions Mara has with the other characters. Mara has such a cheeky personality and is always bantering back and forth, especially with the very naive Detective Harrison. Anyway, he mentions he's looking for Natalie Crow, so we send him off to go find her and continue on our way. So, by this point, some things became pretty clear to me. For one, Mara is clearly not an agent of any kind. And based on how she acts, how other characters treat her, and just her physical size standing next to the other characters, she's clearly not an adult either. At most, she's around driving age at about 16 or 17, and she somehow acquired the police report regarding Edward Crow. But that doesn't really explain anything about what she's doing here and why she's trying to find Edward Crow. Though, I think if you're paying attention, the answer to that is pretty obvious by now. Anyway, also throughout the game, we find a series of letters from someone named Marv to Edward Crow regarding the gold ore business running out of Brazil. This man we meet later in the arcade room, who is known as Marvin Trumbull, who works with Edward Crow to handle his gold ore mine. But as we come to find out through these letters, apparently Crow and Marvin are working together to take gold Tolman has excavated from the Crow Country land and break it down and embed it into rocks to create fake gold ore. But why are they doing that? I mean, as we can see here, they already seem to have perfectly good cylinders of gold. But where does any of that come from, and why are they turning it back into fake ore? Well, now the pieces start falling into place. As we come to find out, the roots mentioned before are these weird green tubes with gold in the center being excavated out from under the park. But without any explanation of where they come from, Edward Crow works with Tolman and Marvin to develop a plan to fake the ore and have it shipped from an unused mine in Brazil. As we find from Marvin's letters though, apparently the Brazilian authorities end up testing this ore to realize the rocks are not from the local Brazilian land, and Marvin has to skip town and heads back to Crow Country to meet up with Edward Crow. Anyway, let's talk about one of the other people working for Edward Crow we haven't discussed yet. We find our way into the office of Douglas Pike, the head of park operations at Crow Country, where we find his body after apparently having committed suicide. There's a nearby VHS from him to Edward Crow condemning them of their crimes, particularly of those against Elaine Marshall. There are also some different lore bits here and there from Pike. In one of his notes nearby, he mentions listening in on one of Tolman and Crow's secret meetings, where he overheard them speaking to someone as if they were a child, which he found extremely weird. Especially because he also notes that Edward Crow is looking very sickly and manic, but Tolman has no response. But ultimately, that's all we really get from Douglas Pike. We also come across Detective Harrison again, where we get a great little dialogue sequence. Yeah, man, I feel you. Why the hell is there a bronze, silver, and gold key? Isn't there a janitor or someone who has all the keys somewhere? And then why in the hell is the excavation site hidden in a tiny house in Fairy Tale Town? Even one of the notes in the game comments on this. Unfortunately, I guess some things are just beyond explanation. Anyway, as we continue making our way through the hellish park, solving all kinds of puzzles and avoiding increasing numbers of enemies and traps, we eventually find ourselves in the office of Tolman himself. He says very little to us, and doesn't give many answers, even to the point of just changing the subject to Mara's purple hair, which he assumes has died. After some back and forth, Mara asks how to fix the elevators leading to the underground areas of the park, and he simply tells us to figure it out ourselves. Well, thanks for nothing, man. So after solving the puzzle in this room, we get this response from him. Yeah, alright pal, I guess it was kinda fun, but screw you anyway. Anyway, also, one very interesting note we get in Tolman's office says the following: "Guests are appearing almost every day now. We can't save them, they're too far gone. But I want to know where they've come from. I found a number, marked in blood on the ground. 2106. It's not a code for any of our locks. It's not a code at all." Throughout the game, we've been seeing the number 2106 written in blood, including at the very beginning of the game right near where we found Arthur Mole. But until now, we haven't really known anything about it. Of course, the natural assumption is it's just a code, but as we know now, that's not it at all. So, with the elevators turned back on throughout the park, we can finally head underground where the mysterious threads of the game's story begin to come together. This underground area consists of a circular path around the park with subrooms branched off with a few different things in them. In one, we notice one of the creatures strapped down to a bed with acid dripping on it. Creepy. What the hell is Crow doing with this? More importantly though, in every room we encounter, we see these, the roots. Each room contains a saw blade and crane to pull the pieces up above. We can see now the roots are these strange mechanical looking green tubes with gold running through them. In one of these rooms, we come across Tolman and Marvin together, who enlighten us on a lot of what's going on. In particular, Tolman explains that the outer shells of the roots are mostly copper, but the internal is 24 karat pure gold. The interaction between these two is hilarious, by the way. Each time you ask them something, they interrupt the conversation and insult each other with these ridiculous names. It's pretty funny. We also get this interaction from Marvin when we try to just get a sense of what he's doing here besides just hiding. This is clearly a bad dude, but not our problem right now. After we turn off the electricity underground that's preventing us from entering Crow's office, we can finally return to the surface and head inside. Throughout the game, we've been getting calls from Edward Crow offering up cryptic bits of information and giving his monologues on how he's felt about the situation he's been dealing with over the years. But one thing I want to point out in particular that I think is interesting is this point where he says, "The first guest emerged from the pool 2 years ago. I've been thinking. It must have been on purpose. The timing, I mean. 1988. It must have been some sort of intersection. A critical pivoting point, if you will. Late enough that we've developed the necessary infrastructure. Early enough as to not be too late, I suppose." The nature of the pool and the roots is still a bit of a mystery to us, but let's just remember this for later. Anyway, looking around Crow's office, we find a photograph of Edward and Natalie together, which opens up a secret path in his office where we see this. Nearby is a diary from Edward Crow as a child. He mentions heading out to Condor Country with his father and coming across some weird thing sticking out of the ground, wriggling back and forth like a bug. His father notices that it's made of metal, and when they keep seeing even more, he cuts off a piece to look inside and finds gold. In the end, Edward Crow's father purchased the Condor Country land and said they could rename it if they want. And of course, that land was renamed to Crow Country, and now belongs to Edward Crow, who inherited the fortune his father wanted to claim for himself. Heading back out of the room, we find Natalie Crow standing next to the gold statue of her mother. She asks if we found Edward Crow yet, which we confirm we haven't. She asks us what we're gonna do when we find him, and asks if we're going to kill him, which Mara emphatically denies. Natalie points out that we brought a gun to Crow Country in the first place, and she can see our intentions in our face as well. She asks for us to find and bring him to her so they could talk, and not to kill him, which Mara hesitantly agrees with. So now we're starting to get a sense of Mara's intentions for finding Edward Crow. But we won't know for sure what happens until we get there, so let's continue. Also found in this room is a slideshow detailing all the behaviors of the various type of guests and the time that they emerged from the pool. This is sort of like a bestiary for the enemies of the game, detailing their appearance and attempting to explain some of the weird biology we're seeing with them. Nearby, we find a degree in biochemistry from Edward Crow, which is pretty interesting, and explains why Crow may have been so interested in studying the guests. At the very least, you wouldn't expect a biochemist to run an amusement park, but we know by now it was never really his desire, but just something he inherited from his father. Anyway, the slideshow with the guest details is also used to solve a puzzle nearby to fix the power for the central elevator of the park leading underground to the pool we've been hearing so much about. So we re-enable the power, fight a little mini-boss, which there are 4 of in total throughout the game by the way, and head out. We find Julie locked up in a crate in the shipping area of the park and get her help to complete one of the puzzles to obtain a battery. But when we come back, we find that she's missing and only blood is left behind. After we find a way to charge the battery, we head back up to the plaza, and at this stage in the game, we walk around an empty and quiet park filled with the corpses of the guests. For whatever reason, all of the guests outside have died, and the only ones remaining are piled indoors, blocking a lot of the paths. But now that we have the battery charged, we can finally fire up this big boy we saw at the beginning of the game, and move him out of the way to access the central elevator and head down. Down here, we find a room filled with guests we have to dodge and weave through to hit 2 switches and open the door. This section is also much more difficult, and the door takes longer to open on hard difficulty, by the way. We do eventually make it through, to unfortunately find the body of Detective Harrison lying dead in the corner.
Look how they massacred my boy.
With that sad revelation in mind, we continue pressing on further past another puzzle until we meet up with Tolman waiting for us. So after talking with Julie and Tolman for a bit, they decide to head out to find Natalie Crow and make their way to the front of the park, leaving us to head down to meet with Edward Crow. With that, we head through the next room and wash ourselves in a small spring, healing us before our journey deeper, where we get this wonderful and emotional scene. I think this is a brilliant tonal choice for the game, and adds an intense weight as we watch Mara allow herself to descend into the heart of darkness and finally end the story we've been fighting to resolve. And once we're finally down here, we find a list of images of every person we've encountered affected by the horror of the roots and the guests and the selfish decisions of man. The only thing left to do now is finally confront Edward Crow. but not before taking a well-deserved shower. Well, if it isn't obvious by now, so, we go ahead and take the vials mentioned and lay out all the items we collected over our journey, once again allowing us to really take in and internalize the trials and tribulations we face throughout the game, which adds a sense of accomplishment and finality to the following scenes. And with all that, we come to the final boss of the game, a horrifying and mutated Edward Crow coming up out of the pool, dropping rocks and swinging his claws at us. With each shot we take to fulfill our promise of ending Crow's life, the liquid below turns redder and redder with his blood, until finally... And so, the game finally comes to an end. We stopped Edward Crow and the horrible spread of the pool and infection caused by the deformed people coming from the other side. But that still begs the question, what is the pool a gateway to? Maybe Elaine, doesn't want to know, but I sure do. Taking a look at the note Crow gives us before throwing himself into the gateway, we read the words of the first guest who arrived in Crow Country. 2106. Uninhabitable. Ruin. We come, 1988. Last chance. Warn, stop, change. 2106. We've seen that number written in blood at different points in the game, but we never knew what it meant. Our first impression is that it's a code for some future puzzle, but as Tolman confirms, it isn't a code at all. What it seems to be is a date. A year. All of the guests seem to be people who have found a way to time travel back to the past at some specific point in time. As Crow hypothesized, a critical pivoting point where we're far enough along to stop whatever tragedy causes the future to fall into ruin. But with that realization comes another. That Edward Crow and his father have now destroyed that chance due to their self-interest and greed. So while we saved many lives, including our own, and maybe things will be okay, I think we know now that they surely won't. Thanks so much for watching my video on Crow Country. I had a great time playing this game, and I think for a lot of people, it's really redefined what a return to survival horror should look like. I think it has a very interesting and cool story that has its own unique twist on some sci-fi horror concepts we've seen before. And I think the game's aesthetic and theme is absolutely spot on at giving survival horror fans that perfect nostalgic feeling that they've been begging for years. Now, I initially criticized the game for missing a lot of what's needed to really fit into the genre properly. But SFB Games has done a great job of listening to the community by both providing the soundtrack we so desperately wanted, but also providing the much needed harder difficulty that I think brings out the full potential of the game. I just highly recommend that if you ever want to play Crow Country for the survival horror aspects at all, you should really play it on the Murder of Crows setting. You also unlock more bonus content from doing the hard mode anyway, so it's worth it for that alone. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video and the awesome world of Crow Country. I look forward to finding more games like this to review and analyze for you. If you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, and feel free to check out my Patreon if you want to support me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you look forward to the next one.